It's a great pleasure to introduce Chris. I met him a couple of years ago when he came to visit UBC, and this last March, he emailed me asking for help analyzing walleye data. It came at a perfect time. It helped me keep my sanity during the time of COVID over the last year or so. We've been working together quite a bit. Chris grew up in Wisconsin. He was an avid sport fisherman, particularly for muskellunge, the hardest fish there is to catch. He did his undergraduate degree at the University of Wisconsin, Stevens Point. He then came to Canada and has been in Canada for the last 10 years, working with John Post at the University of Calgary, where he did a master's degree and is about to complete his PhD in the next couple of 3 months, and it'll be a spectacular doctoral dissertation, and you're going to hear one of the chunks of it from Chris this morning. And I just hope my power stays on long enough that I can listen to it. Chris, take it away.
Thanks for the introduction, Carl. Yeah, Carl said it helped him maintain his sanity. It also helped me maintain my sanity because I think it's a weird time for people doing grad work at the end of their degrees with COVID and everything else going on. So it was a pretty fun experience all around, I think. But all right, let's see if this works now. And of course, it already died. There we go. Okay. So what is the invisible collapse? I know that probably most of the folks in this seminar are not inland fisheries people, but the invisible collapse is basically one of the most influential papers published in inland fisheries science ever, or you could argue fisheries science too, but it basically outlined these arguments around whether inland recreational fisheries might actually be able to collapse. And this probably sounds a little crazy now. Like I think most people assume that you can actually collapse inland recreational fisheries, but at the time that this paper was published, when my supervisor John published it with a bunch of his buddies, the kind of prevailing view at the time was that inland recreational fisheries should be self-regulating. So if anglers, let's say they depressed a population in a lake, the prevailing theory was that anglers should leave that lake and go fish somewhere else so that give that fish population time to recover. And so that was kind of the we'll call it dogma that they were bumping up against with this paper. And it's a really great paper. It used case studies from 5 big recreational fisheries across Canada, but I'm going to say here that they were largely qualitative and anecdotal. They used some theoretical models around depensation to outline and formalize their arguments, but by and large, the evidence for the invisible collapse is qualitative and anecdotal. And it's pretty cool having worked with John for as long as I have. And there was this really interesting blurry-eyed barroom conversation that he and I had in Montreal. I don't know, 5 or more years ago, where he said, there's a question mark after the invisible collapse, Canada's recreational fisheries, the invisible collapse question mark. And he's like, that's because it was largely qualitative and anecdotal. And people seem to forget that, is what he told me. So this picture over here on the right is a picture of Mike Sullivan's grandmother. He's one of the co-authors on the paper and provincial fish science specialist in Alberta with a bunch of fish. And the point is that they used a lot of old pictures to kind of be like, oh, there probably were more fish here than there are now. It's kind of like Pauly's shifting baseline, but with inland fisheries. And so, yeah, why were these declines called invisible? Well, the authors argued that it was about these long timeframes across which the declines were believed to have occurred. So that's the shifting baseline bit. And then because it's kind of impossible to monitor and conduct assessments in all lakes across landscapes. And I've underlined landscapes here to just really drive home the point. This talk isn't about the assessments that go on in the Laurentian Great Lakes or Mille Lacs or big systems like this where people invest lots of money into those specific systems. I think the stuff that we're talking about here is a fundamentally different problem. It's like diffuse resources spread across landscapes that are difficult to monitor and hence assess. So what has the field done since 2002? Well, basically they've developed a bunch of static methods for determining fish population status. And all these citations down here basically figure out one way to relate life history or lake size to yield or things like that. And they're kind of, I don't know if I had to liken them to anything in the oceanic world, they're kind of like productivity susceptibility analyses that I sort of used to work on in the Arctic. They're similar to that, but they're often untested. And in the case of inland fisheries, they often ignore the dynamics of fish populations. And so that's kind of the key motivation for this work. So I have a 1-slide background on walleye because I basically don't have enough time to get into everything. But the idea is walleye were one of the key case studies or central case studies in the invisible collapse. And walleye collapsed in Alberta by about the mid 1990s, but we think that they're recovering due to regulation changes in about 1996. And so in the invisible collapse, the authors argued that, the potential for angling effort appears high, as evidenced by license sales per body of water, basically, and the productivity appears low. So they're northern slow-growing critters towards the northern ends of their distribution. And so this picture on the left here is actually a fishing tournament. I think it's on Lac St. Anne, but I can't remember for sure, where each of these little specks is actually an angler. So if you're a walleye and you swim through there, you're probably going to get snagged, which always kind of cracks me up. But then on the right here, this is just a pretty average sized walleye from one of the lakes. And these fish, we'll show you in a bit, but they can live for quite a long time. And so the arguments in the invisible collapse and a lot of the work that's gone on in Alberta is this: angling efforts high, productivity might be low. One of the, I'll call it a crowning achievement of the Alberta Fisheries program, is that they, after the invisible collapse, they basically implemented this standardized monitoring program in about the year 2000. So I guess it was about the same time as that the invisible collapse was being published with some of the folks in Alberta. They implemented this really great standardized monitoring program. We're going to talk about that in a bit more detail in a second. But the thing that's really remarkable is that despite the fact that these Alberta walleye, these little fin critters, have played a central role in shaping our understanding of sustainability in inland recreational fisheries beyond Alberta, not just in Alberta, despite their conservation concern because of things like high effort, and despite the fact that these fisheries are worth somewhere between $400 and $450 million a year, there's basically been no work on the population dynamics of these fisheries. And so Carl said I emailed him back in March, and that's basically where I was. I'm just going to jump right into the objectives because we got a lot of stuff to talk about. But basically, there's a lot of ways to attack problems like this, and in this case, Carl and I are we're going to seek to die on the trail. We're going to see how many age structure models, assessment models we can fit to the Alberta survey data, so this existing survey data set, as we can, right? We know we're not going to be able to do all of them, but we're going to see how far we can get. And in doing so, we're going to see what we can learn from the data, from the catch at age data, and from these sort of like landscape scale investigations into, walleye population dynamics. So we're going to look at mortality rates, and we're going to plot recruitment trends to basically just poke around and see what we can find. And we didn't really know it would work at the time, but we're going to use the findings to inform understanding of the recovery processes in terms of how did walleye recover after the invisible collapse. So Alberta's fall walleye index netting program is a gill netting program, and so over here on the right, these are the lakes that we're going to include in this study, but they're the solid dots are the lakes that that have been surveyed, and the open circles are the lakes that we don't have survey information for. But the point is that this is a standardized gill netting survey. The experimental design within the lakes is pretty solid. Random locations, mesh panels. They have different depth strata that they segregate these surveys the effort out across. The lakes sampled are not random, and this is a really important kind of experimental design consideration in inland fisheries that receives very little attention. But the point is that where we survey on the landscape is not necessarily random. And we don't survey these lakes every year, right? So these data really represent snapshots of data in space and time. And that's really one of the big challenges of modeling them. One of the really remarkable things about the Alberta Walleye program is they really try to age estimate age in basically every fish that they catch in the surveys. And so we're going to use this data set from 2000 to 2018. And, we have age estimation structures for basically all of the fish. There were some fin rays in the early 2000s. And then thanks to my buddy Owen, they actually switched over to otoliths in 2004. But the point is we have lots of age data. And for, the entire survey represents, the FWIN program represents sampling across 123 lakes. But Carl and I are only going to consider lakes with 3 or more surveys because we had to fit assessment models to data, and it seemed like we should probably have 3 years of catch at age data to try and thread a needle through the data. It seemed like a reasonable start. So it's going to be 43,000 fish, roughly 44,000 fish, and 236 lake years of data is what we're going to do. And it ended up being about 55 lakes that we had at least 3-year surveys for. And so that's what we're going to play with for this talk. So I didn't make these pictures, so don't hate me for this, but I took these directly from the Alberta government's assessment reports, I guess you'd call them. But how they do this currently and how they do their assessments currently is basically they go out, they catch some number of fish in the nets. And so they set a bunch of nets in the lake, and then they bootstrap it. They call it a likelihood profile. I didn't name it that, but they basically look at like the number of fish in the net, and then they rank it from low to high. So if you're colorblind, I'm sorry, but like, you know, they got red, orange, yellow, light green, more green. So they rank it from good to bad. And then basically they try to use that to inform their regulations. That's primarily the tool that they're using to assess and then inform the management actions that are going on in these systems. And so over here, this is just like they bootstrap the length frequency distribution, I guess, and they compare it to like we'll call it a reference lake, but it's questionable like how they get the reference lakes, and they acknowledge this, not just me. So that's what they're doing currently. Like any good fisheries scientist, Carl and I are going to kind of turn those surveys on their head. And so that was from the stuff I showed you on the last slide was from Buck Lake in 2017. And that's this slice of the surveys when you view them together, right? And a lot of folks here have done assessment modeling, so this isn't new to anyone. This is, you know, Paloheimo 1980. But the point is that when you view the surveys alongside one another, you can start to see really interesting patterns in the data, right? You've got age effects going up along the y-axis, you've got year effects going along the x-axis, and recruitment effects going along the diagonals. And one of the things that, you know, we made these plots pretty early on in our exploration of the Alberta walleye data, but one of the things that really struck Carl and I immediately is like, well, the longevity of these fish is such that we might be able to hindcast back in time a bit. And that was, you know, that's the motivation behind the unveiling bit. So in Alberta in 1996, after the managers on the ground kind of recognized that the fisheries collapsed, they instituted these province-wide, like sweeping province-wide stringent regulations where they went from pre-1996, they had like pretty liberal regulations, post-1996, after they recognized the invisible collapse stuff was going on, they kind of like ratcheted everything down with like catch and release catch and release only regulations or very high minimum length limits. And so the point is, if you're a fish that's, you know, age, I don't know, 13 in year 2004, you might carry information about recruitment or mortality back in time before 1996, which is kind of the motivation for this work. It seems silly saying this to UBC folks, but, you know, an age structure model is just a framework for calculations. And so I think like a lot of the ecology folks that I work with tend to focus over here on these state or process components where you've got things like somatic growth or maturity, mortality, recruitment, and, you know, things of that nature. These are the things that get ecologists really excited a lot of the time. These observation components are equally important for interpreting fisheries data, but, you know, I think these are the things that keep assessment people up at night and give us nightmares. But we often don't like my ecology buddies think that these are kind of silly sometimes when I'm working on these things. But anyway, the point of like an age structure model is, you know, you figure out a way to like link these different things, put them together, and then try to estimate them with, or like estimate a model with some data, right? You're trying to like contrast these model predictions with data. And so, you know, that's what we're going to do here. I'm not really going to talk about much of the mathematical details behind it, but like if people are curious about it, they can ask me or Carl at the end. So when you try to assess a landscape, probably a good place to start is to do like a meta-analysis of life history characteristics, because if you think of an age structure model, these things are really important, and that, you know, they're kind of like leading parameters into a lot of your models, into your model. And so we did these things. We did like a life history meta-analysis of von Bertalanffy growth, weight-length relationships, maturity, all of that kind of stuff. And then we basically made the assumption that fecundity at age was increasing proportionally above age of 50% maturity. And we're calculating spawner biomass per recruit in the unfished condition as the sum product of a couple of those vectors above it. Basically, if you don't understand that, it's just this thing is derived from the things above it. But the point is that this is where you have to start. You know, a lot of people say that fisheries assessment models don't account for whatever ecology, but they're deeply rooted in ecology, I think, if you get into the weeds. And yeah, we're going to read these things in as known data. So I know in a lot of assessments, you'll estimate these things explicitly, like in a big integrated analysis and stuff, but you don't really think that's possible across a landscape because the data are a lot more diffuse and they're tricky to model. So we're gonna estimate these things externally. We're gonna read them into the model as data, and then we'll estimate on the catch at age data. So I'm going to talk about two different types of vulnerability, but basically we've got this, sorry, my thing's jumping ahead, but this plot over here is just the catch at age data, the average catch at age data per net in the Alberta FWIN program. So like on average across all the lakes, all the years, this is the basic pattern. And so what Carl and I did is we're going to assume that the vulnerability to the FWIN, to the survey gear, is proportional to swimming speed. So that's the Nathan Taylor et al. 2005 stuff referenced down there at the bottom. The fishing vulnerability bit, we're going to combine length proportional swimming speed with this increasing logistic probability of reacting to the gear. And we inform this using some old creel surveys that Mike Sullivan gave to Carl and I late in the fall, which is pretty cool. So these were surveys that occurred on lakes where the limits were basically, I think it was like 5 or 10 fish per angler. So pretty high bag limit, and there's no size limit. So we kind of know like what anglers are taking, or we could take when they wanted to. So we use those surveys to inform our fishing vulnerability estimates. This is the only equation I had in this talk, but so instantaneous total mortality is equal to instantaneous fishing mortality plus instantaneous natural mortality. And we're going to assume m equals 0.1 for all these analyses according to the Lorentzian equation. So it's size dependent. And just like the life history stuff, we're going to estimate vulnerability schedules external to the model and then read them in. But just a note on M, when Carl and I started this, there's the big Kensington review in Fish and Fisheries that has all these different, indirect methods, I guess they call them, for estimating M. But we were kind of finding that when we applied a lot of those, they seemed a little high relative to the data that we were playing around with in Alberta. So rather than poke around with a bunch of those different methods, we just kind of assumed a base low value of M so that it was easier to assail our model, so to speak. And I think that's important. Okay, so stock and recruitment. I mean, this is bread and butter stock assessment stuff, but we've got two different functional forms. Why do we consider them? Well, because those two different structural uncertainties can mean very different things for sustainable harvest rates. We're going to relate female spawning stock biomass as a proxy for egg production and we're going to use age 2 recruits because that was about as far as we felt comfortable stretching the catch at age data after many trials and tribulations going back and forth in emails and stuff. But we reparameterized all these relationships to talk about, or to estimate on mean unfished recruitment and via that spawner biomass per recruit thing in the unfished condition that I was talking about, and compensation ratio. And compensation ratio is just the ratio of the strength of compensatory mortality in the unfished population versus one at low abundance, right? So it's like if I said that the compensation ratio is 10, it means that there's a 10-fold change in the compensatory mortality between a between an unfished state and a state at low abundance. For this stuff, we use compensation ratio values of 6 and 12 because, well, for a couple of reasons. First, Carl and Ray published a paper recently in Fisheries Research, I think. And this seemed to be pretty plausible given the spawner biomass per recruit and the unfished condition values that we were getting. And they seem pretty similar to the Goodwin et al. 2006 paper for what we were looking at for walleye, right? We're trying to use these meta-analyses to basically inform what we think these compensation ratios might be for Alberta walleye. And the goal here was just to assume low but plausible values for the compensation ratio. And we use these values to inform priors for alpha in the stock recruitment relationship. Okay, the slide's a little tricky, but I think it's cool. So there's a lot of different ways to think about Bayesian statistics, and there's no sense making it overly complex right now. But the point is that you can take the catch at age data in the bubble plots that I showed you, and you can convert that into something like female biomass, right? So that's what these little black dots are. And then you've got this age structured model, which is just a framework for calculations. And it's got a lot of parameters in it, but let's just assume it has 2 parameters. Let's assume it has a stock productivity parameter, and let's assume it has a mortality rate parameter, like fishing mortality rate parameter. So if you assume the productivity is low, and then you assume the fishing mortality rate is high, and you generate a trajectory through your model and plot that, you might find, oh, look, that combination of parameters suggests the stock should be extinct. So that's probably not a very plausible combination of parameters, right? You can do it again, and you can say that the productivity is high and the fishing mortality rate is low, and maybe you overshoot. And you can do this many, many times, like millions of times, and you can start to map out with an appropriate algorithm that accepts some proportion of these trajectories and walks you towards probable answers. And that's basically Bayesian statistics in a nutshell. You draw out a bunch of these kind of things, and then you just draw some lines over it, right? And so the point I want to make here is mainly that, like, these are Bayesian models. These are the same. These are stochastic stock reduction analysis models. If you're an assessment person, that's what we fit. So the Walters et al. 2006 paper describes this exact thing, the threading the needle through the catch at age data kind of idea, and I really like that idea. So that's what we're doing here. Yeah, I think that's mainly what I want to point out here. Yeah, and then at the end, we're just drawing what's the median of those flying spaghetti monster lines and what's the upper and lower quantile of interest, right? And that's what we're doing. So we're going to do that for all the lakes. So the trick now is to be able to fit all those models to a landscape of data. And, you know, a lot of the craft in what I do is figuring out this part. But so we've got 55 lakes. We're going to do 2 stock recruitment relationships to test for that structural uncertainty. And then we're going to assume 2 different compensation ratios. So in the paper that we have a draft of, and hopefully we'll submit not too long from now, we've got 220 models in that paper, okay? And anybody who's modeled with Carl knows that when you're modeling with Carl, you're not just fitting the models you say you're fitting a lot more. So we've done a lot of sensitivity tests, albeit informal ones primarily, just to poke around and see how things behave with different violations of our assumptions, et cetera. I just want to make the point, like I'm fitting an independent stochastic stock reduction analysis model to each lake, right? I'm not sharing information among lakes using hierarchical modeling or anything like that. You could go for it, simulation test it. But the point here is that for the rest of the talk, I'm going to talk about this Beverton-Holt scenario with compensation ratio equals 6, except for one slide, and I'll point that out. But as you can imagine, it's pretty difficult to like visualize the output of 55 assessments, well, 55 lakes worth of assessments across a landscape. And so after sending Carl roughly 10,000 plots, I got really tired of it and I got really frustrated, and I just sat down and I built a Shiny app to communicate this stuff to managers. And so I had to put these pictures. You can go to this link, anybody can go to it, it's live. But so these are the lakes we assessed, and you can click on these little, there's like a drop down box and all kinds of stuff, right? And you can pick the scenario you want. You can click on these little blue icons, and then there'll be a plot that pops up with the trajectories. And there's also this thing that says click here for Tableau, and you can go in and you can basically say, like, if you're a manager, it's like a 1-page kick out for each lake that Carl and I think is really important if you're a manager on the ground. And so that's kind of how we've been communicating a lot of this stuff to the Alberta government, in addition to giving them talks and walking them through things like that. But anyway, that's kind of cool. And if there's anything I've learned in a 7-year PhD in inland fisheries, it's that no one cares how I fit these models, but some of the folks in this room might. So I use STAN, which implements Hamiltonian Monte Carlo via this thing called the no U-turn sampling algorithm. And it was really efficient. Like we did a lot of this stuff pretty quickly, and it depends on the priors and how you formulate the models and stuff, but it seemed to work pretty well for us. And so, yeah, that's my model fitting slide. And so I have this funny slide, you know, hello darkness, my old friend, and Carl wants me to fit 220 state-space Bayesian models again, which no one cares about in inland fisheries. But anyway, moving on from personal vulnerability to another type of vulnerability no one likes to talk about, survey and fishing vulnerability. So these are the things that we estimated externally, and then we read them into our model as data to fit the rest of the models. But you know, so I showed you the average catch per net for the Alberta FWIN data. That's what this is. The blue line is the fit that we get to this relationship. So it fits pretty good. Yeah, we fitted it externally, read it in as data. And then, so on the left here, the left plot, the orange line, I think, is the apparent vulnerability, and the blue line is the vulnerability at age to the gear. So you can kind of see how it's fitting the data. And then on the right-hand side here, you know, you just got the catch at age on the log scale, and then you've got the numbers correct, like the numbers which you get by correcting the catch at age by the correcting for the vulnerability. The reason we had all this vulnerability stuff in here is because the Alberta government, prior to Carl and I, was not dealing with any vulnerability at all. They were just interpreting the raw data. So we've got all these slides that were like explicitly showing, like, look, this is the problem. Like, these fish have increasing vulnerability to at least age 10. Unless you deal with this, this is going to be a problem. So that's why we have these slides in here. Yeah. So this is, I added this slide after some recent work that we did, but the orange line is kind of like the average vulnerability to fishing from across the Alberta landscape for a fish of a given, we'll call it Alberta land fee growth parameter, like an average growing fish in Alberta has that orange kind of fishing vulnerability relationship. But we tested this with some VPA kind of stuff from the creel data that we got in the 80s. And so the black line is like a exploitation rate at age. And so the point I'm trying to make with this slide is that all the stuff I'm showing you is based on those orange patterns, which we allow to vary by lake, depending on the growth characteristics. but we've also done some sensitivity tests to this vulnerability to fishing component, and we get pretty similar answers. Ours tend to be more conservative than the other patterns that we've tested. Okay, now the fun stuff. Okay, so the fishing mortality rates. The first thing I learned doing this stuff with Carl was that you can't estimate fishing mortality, instantaneous fishing mortality every year, because there's no annual data on catcher effort. And Murdoch's probably like, well, you haven't told us anything about catcher effort. He's right, and this is why. So the surveys, the creel surveys that have gone on are really scattered in space and time as well. So there've been 169 creel surveys across the province, but they don't line up with when they do the biological monitoring from the FWIN data. Okay, so that was a really key problem that Carl and I kind of had to figure out a way to get around. And so it turns out when you have an age structure model like this without annual catcher effort data, you can't really estimate fishing mortality in every year. There's this confounding between recruitment and mortality, right? And when you think of like a statistical catch at age model, you're basically using the effort data to kind of disentangle recruitment and fishing mortality. And so what we did to get around that is, rather than estimate these fishing mortality rate terms every year, we instead estimated them for 2 different periods. And we made those periods coincide with the pre-invisible collapse, or like pre-1996, so the invisible collapse period, and post-1996, so like 1997 to 2018. So we've got like this F early and an F late, we'll call them. And so that's what this stuff is. So we basically could get 2 estimates per lake that we looked at. Yeah, so the first thing is these open circle ones are the early period mortality rate estimates, and most of them are all falling on our prior. I'll show you what that means visually in a second, but there's a couple of places where they're actually estimating away from the prior, which is good. And then the other thing that's interesting that struck Carl and I when we first started looking at this is that a lot of the mortality rate, the average mortality rate estimates for these lakes were very low. So places like Pigeon Lake, Lac St. Anne, Gull Lake, they're all very low. And I mean, there are exceptions to that though. There were places with high mortality as well. And I'll show you visually what that means in terms of the catch at age data now. So the first thing I was saying is that a lot of the F early estimates were tracking the prior, but there were some lakes where they estimated quite nicely. And so here's a lake, Winifred Lake, which is, this is a remote guiding, like basically fly-in lodge lake. It's not fly-in, but it's like really remote. And so you can look at the catch at age data, and there were some very old fish present in the first survey in 2004. So this is probably an age 20 fish. So that critter carries with it information back well before 1996. And so in this particular case, we had pretty good estimates of F early, right? And if you look at the later period stuff, there's a lot of old fish all through all the surveys. So you get these low F late estimates too, basically. And I'm going to show you a lake that contrasts that, like Pigeon Lake here. Early on in the surveys, there just are no old fish, right? Like there just aren't. So what's happening here is that the model's saying it's going towards the priors that Carl and I set for those early period mortality rate estimates, because there's no information in the data to pull the estimates away from the prior, right? What's interesting about Pigeon Lake is that there's just like no mortality of the fish, at all. Like when we try to estimate these mortality rates, they're basically like as low as we can. They just go as low as they can, basically, which is pretty interesting. That's not always the case though. So Lac St. Anne is a good example that's similar to Pigeon, where there's not a ton of information on early period mortality rates, but later on we're saying that the mortality rates are very low. And then places like Lac La Biche is really interesting. So there's just like really no fish early on. So we're even saying that we're even moving above. We're saying that the mortality rates might have even been higher than the prior for the early period. And then these late period mortality rate estimates, well, there's just this massive truncation at about age 10 or so, right? Like you compare this picture here with this picture down here, and it's a very different story. So that's kind of what the model's doing. So it's not magic. It's just formalizing what you're seeing in the catch at age bubble plots. We had this slide because in the Alberta program, they basically they rank all lakes relative to what they call a category 5 fish sustainability index ranking. So they rank all lakes relative to some high number of adults, which is equivalent to basically assuming that the carrying capacity is constant across the landscape. So anybody who's fit an assessment model knows you can do this, but like on the left here, you've got the average unfished recruitment And so these are bebopping around the different values. And then over here, you've got this spawner biomass per recruit in the unfished condition, right? And if you multiply this and this, you get spawning stock biomass in the unfished condition. It's something like unfished biomass or carrying capacity, right? So what was cool about this is we could tell that the managers, like, look, this is Pigeon Lake and this is Buck Lake, and those two lakes have higher carrying capacities than Lac St. Anne, which is only about 50 kilometers away, but they're both lower than Sturgeon Lake in the northwest, right? And so that was a pretty cool and useful tool for trying to explain some of those concepts to them. I'm going to use Kobe plots to show you, we built these models, so we're going to use Kobe plots. And I imagine folks in this room are pretty familiar with Kobe plots. The one thing to note on the Kobe plots that Carl and I are going to talk about is ours are scaled to SSBo, so spawning stock biomass in the unfished condition. So we've drawn these vertical lines over here at about 0.4 of SSBo for a given lake. And the reason we did that will be, the reasons why we did that will become apparent in a second. But so this is the Beverton-Holt. Phi is just the compensation ratio equals 6 scenario. This is Pigeon Lake. It's one of the, it's a big fishery in Alberta. It gets a lot of attention and effort, but you can see that under this specific scenario, we've got this egg. And so the yolk is like the 50th percentile and the edge of the egg is the 90th percentile. And then the pepper is the posterior draws. So you can start to visualize these sort of these Kobe plots for lakes across the landscape. And the crosshairs are actually up here in the upper left-hand corner. You can start to do pretty cool things. Like you can look at a Kobe plot across a landscape, right? You've spent all this time building assessment models for all these lakes. You might as well do some fun stuff with them. And there's a couple of things that come out of this that are striking to Carl and I, but one of the things that was really interesting was that a lot of lakes had very low mortality rates and were, so they're down here towards the y-axis, like, they're just down towards 0 on the y-axis. And a lot of them had very high spawning stock biomass relative to what we think the SSBOs were, at least given how we estimated them in the models. So there's a couple of other interesting things to note here. A couple of these lakes up in the upper left-hand quadrant, the first thing to note is that some of those pop out down here. And about the only signal we've been able to find with like easily measurable like landscape scale variables that sort of correlate to these assessment outputs are that Flate, so the late period mortality rate estimate, seems to have a slight positive increase from low to high growing degree days. So these are the highest, the warmest temperature lakes in the province. So what Carl and I think is going on there is actually these lakes probably have a higher M, so a higher instantaneous natural mortality, which would change their rankings and their assessment. But that's what we think is going on down there. But for the rest of them, we're probably not perfect, but we're fairly comfortable with what's going on. So I told you that those plots in the upper left are those lakes that were the lakes that are in this quadrant up here might be sensitive to some of the assumptions about that we're making. But I'll show you this across the stock recruitment relationships and scenarios that we considered. So if you read across rows here, this is Pigeon Lake. This is the exact same plot I showed you a couple slides ago. So that's Beverton-Holt. Compensation ratio equals 6. This is what it looks like with the Ricker. Compensation ratio equals 6. Then Beverton-Holt, compensation ratio equal 12, or Ricker with compensation ratio equal 12. And so the point is, like, for a lot of the lakes that we were saying, like the mortality rate's low and the spawning stock biomass is pretty high, those findings seem to be pretty robust across the range of the sensitivity analyses that we did. Same with Lac St. Anne, that's another good lake. But then there were these lakes that are in the upper left-hand quadrant, like Lac La Biche or Lake Newell, that those assessments, the status assessments kind of change depending on your assumptions about the stock recruitment relationship. So that's important to note and keep in mind. This is where stuff starts to get really fun. And so when you can start to recreate the recruitment dynamics through time. And so this is Lac St. Anne. The orange lines are the recruits that we're estimating, and then the blue lines are like the spawning stock biomass, and the black points are the observed biomass. This is just like the prototype plot that I showed you in the methods where I was drawing this flying spaghetti monster lines. But the point is that, like, what you see is after 1996, you see this big peak in recruits, which then drives spawning stock biomass increases in the early 2000s. But what's interesting is despite this going up, you don't see any more big recruitment pulses. So that's kind of interesting. This lake's in the absolute middle of nowhere, probably we don't even really think it might have collapsed. It's so remote. But it also shows one of these big recruitment pulses in the early 2000s. And it also, despite showing at least some kind of increase in spawning stock biomass through time, it's not really showing greater recruitment levels like we saw in that 2000 peak. This is Buck Lake. This is one of my favorite lakes in the province. It's 50 kilometers west of Pigeon Lake. So it's like an hour and a half from Edmonton. But you start to see these really noticeable cyclic recruitment dynamics, right? These peaks are happening every 6 to 10 years, depending on the lake. But this is the thing that's interesting with this lake. And then this is a system that's in remote northeastern Alberta that certainly didn't collapse. It's just not, or at least none of the managers on the ground think it collapsed or anything like that. It just doesn't get a lot of effort. And you see these really consistent kind of remarkably periodic pulses in recruitment, which is really cool. I showed this plot to my grandma. She really likes walleye. She loves walleye. This woman would eat every walleye in North America if someone let her. And she told me, Chris, what do you mean they have cyclic recruitment? She said, that ain't proper. And I was like, Grandma, you are correct. That is not proper. And Carl and I have been trying to kind of figure it out ever since. You can kind of look across the whole landscape, and you can, so these blue bars, I don't look at any specific lake, but the point is that the blue bars are indicating places that had recruitment pulses that were 10 to 40 times the average recruitment level for that lake in the years like 1998 to 2002. We just kind of picked it arbitrarily, but the point is that like a lot of lakes, regardless of whether they had a high F early or a low F early, or whether they were near or far from cities or whatever, they had these big recruitment pulses that occurred in the early 2000s. So that's what the blue bars are indicating. I think it was 33 out of the 55 lakes that we assessed had that. The second thing is that there's at least some evidence, and it depends on how you do the clustering, but somewhere between 6 and 15 of the 55 lakes that we assessed seem to have some evidence of cyclic recruitment dynamics. So that was pretty wild. Okay. I think a lot of this work that Carl and I have done kind of confronts this idea in inland fisheries that, neither the data nor the technical tools exist with which to assess fisheries across broad spatial temporal scales like we did here. And I think that's important to point out because I think there's a lot of data sets that are similar to the Alberta FWIN data that the Alberta FWIN data set that you could use to actually ask some of these really cool questions about sustainability and population dynamics across landscapes. But from a management perspective, the things that struck Carl and I as being important to tell the Alberta folks is that the dynamics that we unveiled kind of suggest that the management actions might be triggered, even if in a hypothetical situation, if F were 0, right? Because you've got these really variable dynamics in the recruitment, and which you sometimes can see in the spawning stock biomass trajectories as well. But the system in place right now is based only on adult numbers, right? Like they just look at the number of adults, they count it, and then they put it into a category. And so you can build simple age structured models and basically show that there's a high chance that you're triggering management actions even in situations where F would be 0. The second thing that I walked you through is this, the carrying capacity across the landscape varies. No ecologist actually believes carrying capacity is constant among lakes, or certainly even within a lake across time maybe. But the point is that the current plan in place that Alberta has basically assumes a single target for all lakes, and we don't think that's ideal. And we've shared this information with them. And I showed you this in the plots where you can go 50 kilometers away from Buck Lake to Lac St. Anne, and you can get different targets potentially. And one of the things that Carl and I suggested to them is that they should probably focus on spawning stock biomass rather than numbers of mature fish, because we think it's probably a better index of eggs, right? So that was basically our advice to the Alberta government on this slide. This is a big finding. So our assessments kind of indicated that these fisheries, many of the fisheries were lightly exploited, which is very interesting. But I want to preface that by saying that our FMSY, so the sustainable, the fishing mortality rates that would achieve MSY, the estimates that Carl and I provided are actually the first quantitative estimates that we have that demonstrate that Alberta walleye are vulnerable to over-harvest, and thus you need regulations probably to sustain their sustained populations. All of the FMSY values that we estimated were in the range of like 0.2 to 0.3 under conservative assumptions about the stock recruitment parameters. And so like that's a pretty big finding, because it helps us sort of put a cap on, you know, what we, or like have a limit, right? Like that's just really critical for objectives and everything like that. But so with that in mind, the finding that there were foregone harvest opportunities really challenges a lot of the existing views on walleye management in the province. And so like Mike Sullivan's on my committee, and we've had a lot of conversations about this stuff, and I think he's finally on our side with this stuff. But it's been a very interesting, and there's been some very interesting conversations around this, because we're showing that they're easy to overharvest, but we're also showing that there are foregone harvest opportunities, and that's a pretty interesting and, you know, tricky challenge to navigate. You know, I wrote this off, or not wrote this off, but like I think part of this is because both Post et al. And Sullivan in 2003, these two papers that have driven basically all of the walleye management program in Alberta since 2002 or so. I think both of these papers, they cite mortality as like the key driver of Alberta walleye fisheries, but they don't estimate these reference points like the FSY stuff that we kind of explicitly got at here. And so the trick is, like, how do you figure out when there's new fishing opportunities, right? Or when overfishing, so, you know, the y-axis of the Kobe plot, when is that occurring? Like, you can't really do that unless you're actually explicitly estimating mortality rates and things like that. And for the managers on the ground, you know, our basic advice was like to keep fishing mortality rate below 0.2 to 0.3. And if you're going to enact policies that potentially go over that, you should probably do that in an experimental framework. Okay, this is pretty wild. So many lakes around the province, regardless of their proximity to cities or, you know, what we think are proxies for angling pressure, showed these large recruitment pulses around 1998 to 2002, which Carl cleverly called his Y2K pulses. And so I started calling them that. And now it makes me laugh. But the point is that they occurred throughout the province, and they seem to have partially driven recovery in many of the lakes throughout Alberta. And that was really interesting to us. Like that was pretty striking and notable. And it was something that we hadn't seen in the literature, either in the invisible collapse or in the subsequent Sullivan papers or anything like that we've ever seen from Alberta. And so we found that very interesting. And we're still trying to figure out what's causing these things. And, you know, it's easy to say this, they could be due to strong environmental forcing or cannibalism, but it's a little more difficult to pin down exactly what's going on with those. And I'll talk about the cyclic dynamics on the next slide. But the point is that I've got a gazillion lines of code trying to figure out, you know, whether these pulses are related to easily measurable variables like shoreline development index or total dissolved solids or position on the landscape. I plot these things east, west, north, south. I try to compare lakes with pulses, without pulses, and I haven't really been able to find anything super useful yet, which is interesting in and of itself, I think. So if you were in Carl's talk a couple of weeks ago, he showed you a plot of some Alberta walleye, which if he had told me, I would have given him a prettier plot, but this is the prettier plot down here. So the little gray lines in the background are the posterior medians of the individual recruitment trends from the lakes. When you just this is the result of a clustering analysis we did on the recruitment time series to just see if we could actually cluster out those cyclic dynamics. And I think like the thing that's really interesting here is that, so it's somewhere between 6 and 15 of the lakes seem to have some evidence of cyclic recruitment, but you know, cycles are a hallmark of complex population dynamics. And I think that their detection in an inland fishery like this is a striking reminder of the difficulties associated with using methods or approaches for assessing or learning from fisheries that like ignore the dynamics of fish populations, right? Like this stuff's like might be right under our nose sometimes. And we don't know what's causing this. It's pretty remarkable. You know, it's the same alternatives as the Y2K pulses. It could be strong environmental forcing and or cannibalism. Carl and I have done some preliminary work with environmental correlates, similar to like what I said with the pulses on the last slide, but we haven't really found anything consistent, which is quite interesting. Like, so you can plot, you know, like the El Nino or La Nina kind of things, and you can look at, they go into and out of phase with different lakes. It's just not consistent. And we've actually built some simple cannibalism processes into our assessment models to explicitly estimate those parameters. But then when we estimate those parameters on the data and we try to simulate them, we don't get dynamics that are like this. So that's wonky. And it could just be the way we've formulated the cannibalism process, right? It doesn't mean I'm not like ruling anything out here, but the point is we've been trying and we haven't really found much so far. So that's interesting in and of itself. And we think like this has implications for sustainable harvesting, right? And Carl talked about this in his talk, but you know, it's the Parma de Riso dilemma. It's, you know, if it's the environment and you harvest hard, you could run into problems. If it's cannibalism, you might actually free the stock from that that mortality, and you might be able to sustain some kind of stable yield or something like that. And what's really interesting about this is that currently there's this lake in Alberta called Siebert Lake, which is cited in the Invisible Collapse and in Sullivan 2003, which is this paper talking about Alberta walleye. But the only lake in the province that exclusively experienced recreational fishing during the Invisible Collapse was Siebert Lake. And it's one of the lakes that we think has these cyclic dynamics. So it brings up all these interesting questions about like, how do we study, should we be studying like the effect of cyclic dynamics on recreational fishing policies, for example, and stuff like that. Okay, I'm gonna wrap it up here. So, you know, it can be said that none of the stuff that we've done here is really new or novel, and I think that's pretty interesting. And yet coupling these old age structured modeling tools with existing landscape scale inland fisheries data has allowed Carl and I to reconstruct the recovery dynamics of walleye following the Invisible Collapse, which is one of the most influential fisheries papers in inland fisheries ever. And what's remarkable to me is that in doing that, we've kind of unveiled this remarkable complexity of ecological dynamics that has basically gone unrecognized for, nearly 2 decades or more than 2 decades. And so I think a lot of this stems from this idea that you see in inland fisheries. I put up people here who have tenure, but you see these quotes a lot. It's impossible to assess and monitor and assess all fisheries across the landscape. And I think like that's a lot like standing on the starting line of a 100-mile race and looking at each other and being like, well, can you run 100 miles? And they're like, no. And can you run 100 miles? No. And then we collectively decide we're not going to step 1 foot. And Carl and I, the spirit of this paper and this work was decidedly different. We just knew we were going to die on the trail. So we just said, okay, we're going to go as far as we can. We made it to 55 lakes. Some people might've made it further, others less, but I think we've learned a lot in the process. And I think that's really cool. And, just to really drive this point home, and it's probably not surprising to many people here, but like, there's a lot of reasons to employ methods like what we employed here, but I think it's really important to recognize that age structure models provide a consistent and explicit framework through which you can kind of test different hypotheses or prevailing views about the sustainability of fisheries against the available data, right? There's a lot of dogma and stuff in inland fisheries that's very difficult to sort through sometimes. And models like this have provided a pretty effective way to be able to be like, okay, well, if you think this, let's follow that logically to its conclusion, right? And we can do that with models, and that's kind of fun and pretty interesting. And I think that's like how we probably start to advance the, science of inland fisheries conservation and management. That's it. That's all I've got. So I hope I didn't go too far over time. But I just want to thank the people who pay me, thank the people who collected all the data, and lots of people who helped me throughout the process of working with Carl. So with that, I'll take any questions.
Carl has to interject here one point. Is the original arguments about recreational fishing not ever causing severe stock collapses is a single species argument, right? It says if only there were only walleye in these lakes, people would stop going to them when they couldn't catch any fish.
Yep.
And populations would stabilize at low levels. All of these fisheries are multi-species fisheries, and that's true of the original commercial fisheries that caused the original depletion, as well as the sport fisheries of today. People don't go out hunting for walleye much; they go out fishing, and they catch northern pike and a whole bunch of other things. And if there's lots of perch in a lake and lots of northern pike, which are very productive, you can end up completely destroying a single species that's a preferred species, but not the only thing that attracts them.
I totally agree with you. And I think that the other thing to recognize is that that's a very harvest-based view, right? Like because people were making that view though, right? Like that the fisheries were self-regulating in northern Wisconsin. People were making that argument. It's in the literature. You can see it. It might be bogus, but like that's what the prevailing view at the time was. But you can even look at Len Hunt's argument, right? Like with what drives anglers to fish where they fish. Like if you like a lake because you like going to that lake and you're going to keep going to that lake regardless of your catch rate. Like I know a lot of people who fish like that, right? Like I'm going to go fish my reef in this lake because I know how to fish it, right? So I agree with you, but I think that the prevailing view at the time was more so that we shouldn't be able to see those collapses in inland fisheries, whether or not it was correct or not, right?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Chris, for a really fascinating talk. I had just a question about like more fish interactions. in some systems there's like egg predation, and let's say like if there's angling maybe targeting on also some egg predators, and that the egg predator density changes, could that be a factor at all in recruitment dynamics in these lakes?
Sorry, Murdoch, my Zoom cut out. Could you repeat the very end of the question? Sorry.
Yeah, just wondering about like, is there any knowledge about sort of egg predation and how that might vary over years in these lakes?
Good. Well, so good question. And there's the Kitchell and Walters paper that talks about cultivation depensation. And one of the hypotheses in that paper is like whether there's interactions between like minnow populations and walleye, right? Dynamics. And so the point being like maybe the walleye can eat down the minnows, which predate on the walleye eggs. So there's lots of hypotheses like that, but we don't really have the data to, like, we don't have the data from the FWIN program or even like any kind of auxiliary data that we might really be able to test that stuff with, or at least that I'm not aware of any of that. Are they good, important hypotheses to test? Absolutely, if we could figure out a way to test them, right? That's the primary one that I'm aware of in the Alberta fisheries that would like directly impact like recruitment, like you're talking about like that. But I'm sure there's others, right?
What are they like? I know nothing about these like spawning ecology of walleye. Like,
so they're broadcast spawners. They spawn in the springtime. They spawn typically in like right when the ice is kind of coming out. So usually you'll see fishermen like in the Great Lakes region. You'll see them standing in freezing water trying to catch them at night. But they spawn at night. They spawn on shallow reefs. Broadcast spawners.
They're one of the very few freshwater fish that has a pelagic larval stage.
Yeah. And one of the things that's really interesting, Murdoch, is like, so the cannibalism models that Carl and I kind of preliminarily fitted to the data, you know, the models we made were assuming that the predation was by adults on the progeny. But, you know, there's at least, I sent Carl this cool paper that I found from the 80s or something in Saskatchewan, I think, but it shows that these little tiny fry, they'll actually chain up, they'll eat each other, hey? So there's like intra cohort cannibalism going on, and this paper argued could be a pretty substantial source of mortality. So that's another avenue to look at, right? Which we haven't looked at yet because I'm trying to finish my thesis. But that's a cool idea too.
But that would produce Beaverton Holt recruitment.
I think so too. But yeah.
Have there been any regions where there's been stocking of walleye to look at, like, let's say, how do the populations sort of behave when you have, let's say, constant stocking of walleye?
So good question. And I had a slide from the talk I gave to the Alberta government that I ripped out because I wanted to make sure I didn't go long. But we tried to estimate stocking explicitly. We've linked up stocking, all the stocking data in the province to all the stuff we've done here. And we tried to estimate stocking like survival explicitly in our models, but it was the things we know are that it's very low. It's like less than 1% on average probably, but it's highly variable, right? And so these are like Lac La Biche, Pigeon Lake, and Lac Newell are the three most heavily stocked fisheries in the province. So there's at least some evidence in Lac La Biche. So what we've done here is we've just taken the number of fish stocked per hectare 2 years prior, and then assumed that only 1% of them survive, and then overlaid those points on our posterior medians. Hey, so we're not estimating, we're just like assuming, we're trying to visualize, right? And and so there's at least some evidence that maybe stocking helped jumpstart the Lac La Biche fishery. And you could think the same about Pigeon, but what's interesting about Pigeon Lake is only 50 kilometers away is Buck Lake, which never received any stocking, but its dynamics look like this, right? So like, what's your control, right? It's like the experimental design of the problem is quite tricky. In general, the Alberta program suffers from a lack of like, when they implement things, just like many agencies, right? Because it's difficult for political reasons or whatever. It's very difficult to have, like controls and manipulations, kind of like that might help you answer those questions. But I think that's where they need to go if they want to start to unveil some of these things we found even further, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, to some extent. I thought there was some sort of experimental lakes program, but that was canned, wasn't it?
Well, there's one in Ontario, so you're only a few thousand kilometers off. But no, I'm just teasing you.
Yeah.
But there aren't really in Alberta. There was one PhD student who did some adaptive management for his thesis, but the work was like over 2 years. And so I think a lot of the dynamics that we're unveiling here, you know, like I've read your work. So like, you know, these are going to be longer term kind of experiments if you want to start to figure some of these questions out, right?
There must be some other questions. There's a bunch of people who should be asking questions out there.
I can't really see the chat box. So if anybody asks a question in there, you'll have to tell me.
The mics are open if you'd like to go ahead and just shout out your question.
Maybe I bored everybody and they just logged off.
So this is Eric. I just wondering whether there has been any trends in catch and release behavior on the part of anglers over this sort of long time series, and if there has been, how that would affect the way fishing mortality.
That's a great question.
Yeah, you see what I mean.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. No, it's a great question. I'm just trying to think because I've spent a lot of time in public consultation meetings trying to talk about these things with anglers. I think I don't have any solid evidence one way or another as to whether those things are changing. But as an angler, obviously, you know, over the past even 10 years, there's been a pretty marked change towards catch and release, right? But I will say that there is a strong push for more harvest, right? Like anglers, these things are like prairie lobsters, right? They're pretty tasty critters. Hence why my grandma wants to eat all of them. But that's not everyone, and you're right. And like, there's competitive fishing events in Alberta that are like, they're like tournament anglers, and they're like musky anglers in the sense that they won't want to keep a single walleye, right? How that influence, I mean, so I don't have any data one way or the other to say. That's one interesting thing. I wish Mike Sullivan would be a good person to ask that question, the exact question to, and I need to think about that, Eric.
But traditionally, walleye is not a game fish, right? It's a meat fish.
I think that really depends, though.
I mean, it's like catching a log.
Yeah, I think that really depends, because like there's a select group of anglers that, like, you know, they give their soul to catch a 30-inch walleye, right?
Oh,
and so there are those different factions among, like, that's the challenge with recreational fisheries, right? Like, there's just these really different and diverse user group interests, right? But
so what you would expect, though, is that you would expect that you would get higher spawning biomass and lower fishing. You'd expect to get higher spawner biomass and lower fishing mortalities. I'm just trying to figure it out in my head. And
well, so you're right. But I think the other thing to keep in mind is that, so some of these lakes, like Pigeon Lake, are managed under like a harvest lottery, right? Like, you have to enter a lottery and buy a tag to be able to harvest a fish. So unless you're indigenous. And so I don't think it's as simple as saying, you know, this is what catch and release mortality is doing, right? Because, like, we don't allow open harvest on Alberta Walleye lakes, really, right? We have like high minimum length limits and maybe a 1 fish bag, right? Like, that's pretty much like what that changed just recently because there's a bunch of political drama going on in the province. And so they're starting to do other regulations like slot limits, which Carl and I probably suggest is a bad idea, but nobody listens to us anyway. So the point is that, like, there's a lot of different competing interests, and I don't know that. Yeah, I'm not answering your question very well because I don't have good information on it one way or another, but it's a good question. So thanks for asking it.
Okay.
Unless you have other thoughts on it, I don't know.
Question here.
Yeah.
Yeah. It sounds like it sounds like, I don't think you mentioned that there were any tag-based estimates of exploitation rate ever done on any of these lakes. Has anyone tried to directly measure fishing mortality on a lake?
Good question. The answer is no. And in our discussion, Carl and I say that the biggest uncertainty is probably related to that, and that we should probably try and do something like that, right? Or focus on better even more cost-effective methods of getting effort data paired with these biological survey data that they're already collecting, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But what's interesting is when you take the creel data, and Carl and I played around with them a ton, when you take the creel data and you try to like relate them to, so the number of dead fish per hectare relative to the number of fish in our models, like, you know, Carl, you did this. What did you find? You were like all the mortality rates were pretty low. We were making some assumptions, but I think our general findings were that, you know, they seem to be pretty consistent with the low mortality hypothesis in many situations.
Way too many old fish.
Yeah.
The tagging thing, there's been one really neat tagging study in the southeast using acoustic tags so that they can be certain the fish was alive and be certain when it was removed and so on from repeated acoustic tracking. And that kind of thing, you need to do that, Rob, and it's outrageously expensive. So basically, just the age composition though is telling us that on most of those lakes, the mortality rate just cannot be high. There's way too many old fish, and these cohorts persist for way too long in lakes that have been sampled multiple times.
So something that's kind of an interesting aside and insight to what Carl just said is when I've made these bubble plots for a couple of years. Like when I first met Carl in Vancouver a couple of years ago, I showed him some of these plots, but I've showed those plots to a lot of people around Alberta, and they're like, yeah, so what? That's how our walleye are here. And it wasn't until Carl and I took the time to build a model that explicitly estimated those mortality rates that people started to believe those arguments, right? Like you can argue that on the one hand, we've just visualized all of the data for folks, but it's definitely useful to try and estimate those things and be like, look, they are low, right? Because I don't think, this probably sounds crazy to folks on the coast, but like a lot of folks here are not trained in fisheries assessment or age structure modeling and stuff like that. And so it's tricky to sometimes convince people. But yeah.
A bit of a related follow-up, if you don't mind.
Of course.
I think you mentioned that a lot of the lakes are managed now with a minimum size limit and a low daily quota. Is that probably about right, generally speaking?
That's approximately right. But since 2000, there's kind of been a Cambrian explosion of regulations, which is largely like manager specific, and it's not a very easy question to get at, but go on.
Yeah, okay. So my question is going to end up being a question about what's catch and release mortality like for a smaller walleye, and are the size limits anywhere near size of maturity? Something like that.
All the size limits are above size of maturity because everybody was freaked out after the invisible collapse, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's like a specific thing that they've built into it. But the other question about catch and release mortality is very interesting, because catch and release mortality is the reason that a lot of the quotas for like the harvest lottery program were very, very low, is because they were assuming very high catch and release mortality rates. But what happened that was very interesting is Carl and I estimated Z, right? Whether we're estimating F or not, you can argue, but we're estimating Z. And the estimates that we're coming back with are like far lower than the catch and release mortality rates that were being assumed by the agency. Right. So that's a very telling. I'm not saying there's no cryptic mortality. You know, obviously that's very important, especially for fisheries like this, I think. But it certainly seems to be lower than what has been assumed previously.
Great, thanks. Seems like there's lots of opportunity to do tag-based experiments to answer a number of questions.
I feel like with data sets like this, there's a career of opportunity, right? Like you could do, what do you want to do? You want to study synchrony? You want to study tag-based mortality? You want to do management strategy? What do you want to do? It's world. There's no one, like it was Carl. Like that's the craziest thing. Like Carl and I are the only people working on this, right? Like
it's a lot like that in British Columbia too, with freshwater fisheries.
I guess I don't know. I've never really worked on those fisheries, but yeah it's pretty...
yeah. There's lots of things a person could focus on.
Yeah. Cool. Thanks for the questions.
Thank you.
These long-lived things, Rob, are much easier to work with than bogans, than rainbows that die after spawning and have these nasty short-lived patterns and so on. It's really great to just work on a fish that lives long enough to really expose its mortality patterns clearly to you.
Yeah. I think like what's so cool about this is you can just look at the bubble plots, right? And like, I don't know. I think that's pretty cool, but Well, thanks for everyone's attention. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I just had one more question. And that's the over the longer term, like the longer term dynamics. Like you had kind of an earlier phase where there was like presumably collapsed for a lot of lakes, low abundance for many years, and then kind of a recovery, this invisible recovery, and I just wanted to get your sort of feeling for, like, with all the modeling and analysis you've done, is it just like this mysterious recruitment that occurred like at the end of the 90s that sort of caused the recovery, or is there something else, like like license sales as well? Like I had no idea about like how his effort and sort of angling interest changed over the years.
Good question. And I skipped over a lot of that in the interest of time, but it's not that the regulation changes didn't help, right? We just think we rolled double sixes and got lucky with the environment as well. And so it seems like it was a combination of regulations and these environmental or whatever recruitment effects that occurred. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that there's some evidence that when the stringent regulations went on in the 1996 period, that, you know, fishing effort may have dropped for a little bit, but it seems to have come back, and everybody's, like, lots of people are fishing now. Some of the highest efforts we've ever seen in Alberta seem to be happening, like, you know, in the last few years. But in terms of like, there's a third part to your question. I feel like I can't remember. My brain's kind of going Murdoch.
I just, yeah, the longer term sort of, you've answered most of it. It's just like, you've answered what's been happening to angling, sort of license sales, like angling effort, and then in all experience with your modeling and analysis, your feel for what's driven that recovery. And you've said it's like rolling double sixes. So I think your answer is great.
Yeah, I think it's a combination of things. And I think, like, so the Alberta government, when we give these meetings to them and we've talked about them with this stuff, they're always like, well, we need to figure out what's causing these recruitment things. And you know, that's part of it. But like the other part of it is that they probably need like some value of information modeling to figure out like how to optimize their monitoring, right? Or like, how can we triage this stuff rather than just, I'm not saying one thing's more important than the other, but like there's a lot of room for really interesting applied questions and with these kind of things. Like I've only just barely touched the tip of the iceberg, right? So
did you actually introduce in your modeling per lake like the regulation effect when those things were introduced?
No, because like for all lakes, we assume that the biggest regulation change was that 1996 regulation change. And what we did is we set informative priors for those two periods for lakes based on what the available creel survey data. So there are 169 creel surveys, and what Carl did something really clever, kind of blew my mind, honestly. So what we did is we looked at from the 80s to present day, like what the average increase in angler catch was over that period, right? And then we built like simple age structured models with parameters similar to ours. And we were like, okay, well, vulnerable biomass must have increased by this. If vulnerable biomass increased by approximately this much, what did that mean for the mortality rates that had to be in those two periods on average? So that was how we did it. You can argue that that's not right, but that was the best that we thought we could do with the data that we had. The trick is we tried to look at the regulation effect a little bit and like modeling it explicitly, but the challenge was that the regulations change so quickly and they're just like, it's literally like a Cambrian explosion of regulations across the landscape, which is kind of scary, right? Like it's not easy to evaluate the effects of the regulations. It maybe better, smarter modeling could figure that out, but I haven't figured out a way to do that yet.
Okay, great. Thanks again, Chris.
Yeah.
Yeah, really fascinating work and analysis. So
thank you, Murdoch. Thanks, everyone.